Heading into week 16 of the fantasy football season, here's a few defense special team units I look to get on the wire this week. The first one, the Jacksonville Jaguars. So obviously, the Jaguars, they haven't been a good defense at all this season, but it's a 1 week ad here at the Jets, who give up the fifth most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So right here, arguably two of the worst teams in the league going at it here in week 16. The last few weeks for this defense haven't been pretty, though. Week 13 at the Rams, 37 points allowed, a sack. Week 12 at the Tennessee Titans, 20 points allowed and 4 sacks. In Week 15 versus the Houston Texans, 30 points allowed, a sack and an interception. So like I mentioned here, they're at the Jets. Zach Wilson, he hasn't been impressive, in my opinion, in his rookie year here. And I think this Jacksonville team could make a few plays for the most part at the Jets. And right now they're available in 94% of fantasy leagues. So if you're in a pinch at defense, I think I would give the Jacksonville Jaguars an ad this week. The second defense, the Atlanta Falcons. So the Falcons, same thing as Jacksonville. A defense this season that pretty much can't stop anyone or get anything going. But right here, another good matchup versus the Lions, who give up the seventh most fantasy points to defenses on the season. And Jared Goff, we don't know if he's going to play in this game. He's on the safety and protocol list as of now here. So the last few games here for Atlanta's defense, Week 13 versus Tampa Bay, 30 points allowed, an into and a pick six. Week 14 at Carolina, 21 points allowed, a sack, a pick six in that one, a fumble recovery, 2 interceptions. And Week 15 at the San Francisco 49ers, 31 points allowed and a fumble loss. So right here, I think they could have a decent ball game versus Detroit. They're not totally a bad defense where they really can't do anything like Jacksonville has all season. But right here, they could make a few plays. We saw them have a pick six in Week 13 and Week 14. So maybe here in Week 16, they could have a decent game versus a weak Detroit Lion offense, especially if Jared Goff's at him. Right now, this Falcon DST, they're available widely in 96% of fantasy leagues. But I would definitely give them an ad this week. The next defense, the Los Angeles Chargers. So the Chargers here have a nice matchup as well this week coming up at the Houston Texans that give up the 6th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. And Davis Mills, he's been up and down so far this season. And obviously this Texan team going nowhere this year. So the last few games here for the Chargers, Week 13 at Cincinnati, they had a huge game, 22 points allowed, 6 sacks, 2 interceptions, 2 fumble recoveries, including a touchdown off of them as well. Week 14 versus the Giants, 21 points allowed, 2 sacks and fumble recovery. And Week 15 versus Kansas City, 34 points allowed, a sack and and a fumble recovery. So right here, Week 16, like I mentioned, good matchup at Houston. Gives up the 6th most fantasy points. Davis Mills should be under duress early and often in this ball game. And the Chargers need this game bad after losing a tough one in overtime versus Kansas City. So right here, they're available in 50% of fantasy leagues is this Charger DST. And I definitely would give them an ad this week. The next defense, the New York Jets. So right here, the Jets, what could I say? They can't stop anyone. I think a college football team could score a decent amount of points versus this Jet defense. But anyway, the Jets right now have the matchup of all matchups for a defensive unit versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. They give up the most fantasy points to DST. So this could be one of the ugliest games of the season here between arguably two of the worst teams in all of pro football this week versus the New York Jets and the Jaguars in Week 16. So the last few weeks here for this Jet DST. Week 13 versus Philly, 33 points allowed, 2 sacks. Week 14 versus New Orleans, 30 points allowed, 3 sacks. And Week 15 in Miami, they had a decent showing in terms of picking up fantasy points. 31 points allowed, a sack, 2 interceptions, and a fumble recovery for a touchdown. But right here versus Jacksonville, the Jets are at home at least. I think they can make a few plays in this game. Trevor Lawrence, he's been horrible for the most part of his rookie season. And the Jets are available in a whopping 98% of fantasy leagues. And the fifth and final defense I look to get on the wire this week here is the Seattle Seahawks. So the Seahawks, a sloppy ball game it was on that Tuesday night game at the Los Angeles Rams, where they lost 20-10 in that one. But they made a few plays on Stafford. They got to him a few times, which was good to see. And they got a great matchup versus the Chicago Bears, that their offense is in a total tailspin besides maybe Mooney and David Montgomery. So right here, the last few weeks here for Seattle, they've been serviceable at least here. Week 13 versus San Francisco, 23 points allowed, a sack, 2 interceptions, a fumble recovery. Week 14 at Houston, 13 points allowed, 2 sacks. And week 15 at the Rams, like I mentioned, it was a sloppy division game on a weird Tuesday night, 20 points allowed, 4 sacks, and an into. So right here, the Bears give up the 4th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. And Seattle's available in 65% of fantasy leagues. And to be honest here, Justin Fields, he really hasn't shown me much. I know both of these teams are going nowhere this season with bad records. But anyway, I think they can make a few plays here, Seattle. They're at home, which is always a good thing with the 12th man. And I think they're a decent ad this week. So that's a few defenses I look to get on the waiver wire here for week 16 of the fantasy football season.